Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Shayantani Pal, Associate Professor, Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Calcutta. Today we shall have some discussions on the Vakataka polity. Our subject is Indian culture and the paper is Indian polity, and today we shall have some discussions on the Vakataka polity and administration. Now, who were the Vakatakas? The Vakatakas were actually the successors of the Shatavahanas in Deccan. Earlier, we had some modules on the administration of the Mauryas, on the administration of the Satavahanas, and then we shall have some discussions on a separate module on the administration of the Guptas. So to provide a linkage between the Mauryan polity and the Gupta polity, we shall have some discussions over the Vakataka polity. Here are our learning objectives. First, we shall begin with some introduction regarding the Vakatakas, where did they rule, etc., and their period of rule, and then we shall have some discussions on the king, the position of the king in the Vakataka polity, and then we shall have some discussions on the feudatories of the Vakatakas and the relationship of these feudatories with the king. Then we shall have some discussions on the queens, because as you will see that the queens were very important in the polity of the Vakatakas, a very uncommon feature in ancient Indian polity. Then we shall have some discussions over the administrative units, the officers involved in administration, the sources of revenue. Then we shall summarize our discussion. Now, this is the territory of the Vakatakas on the basis of the find spots. As you know that the Vakatakas had issued several inscriptions and most of them are land grant charters. First, they began with the land grant charters in a mixed language which was Sanskrit and Prakrit. But soon they moved on to Sanskrit, and all the subsequent charters, apart from their very first charter, that is the Vasim copperplate, all the subsequent charters were issued in pure Sanskrit language. So this is a map of the Vakataka territory on the basis of their find spots of their inscription. This has been prepared by V.V. Mirashi, who is one famous scholar and who compiled all the inscriptions of the Vakatakas in a volume of the Corpus Inscriptionum Indicarum. So here we have Matsya on the west and we have Malava. So Matsya covers Rajasthan and Malwa covers the western part of the present Madhya Pradesh. Then we have the Godavari Valley. Then below that region we have Vidarbha. Vidarbha is the most important part of the Vakataka territory, and the center of their rule was in the Vidarbha region. And below that we have the kingdoms like Mulaka, Ashmaka and Kuntala. All of them were situated further west in the coastal region. So this was the territory ruled by the Vakatakas, prepared on the basis of the find spots of their inscription. Now the Vakatakas, as you can see, they ruled in central India and the northern part of the Deccan. They were contemporary to the Guptas. When did they rule? The Vakatakas ruled between circa 300 to the 500 CE. So as you can see, they were actually contemporary to the Guptas, and this is the reason that why we should have a study on the Vakataka polity separately, because it was during the Guptas that they had built a separate administrative structure in this region, which some of the elements they adopted from the Satavahanas, like the divisions, the names of the territorial units, and some other elements they adopted from the Satavahanas. And then again there are some elements they adopted from the Guptas. So there was a very unique synthesis in the administration of the Vakatakas from some elements from the Guptas and adopted from some elements from the Satavahanas. So this is the reason for which we shall study the Vakataka polity separately. So on the basis of the geographical distribution of their inscriptions, K.M. Shrimali, who has another important study on the Vakatakas, the name of his study is Agrarian Structure in Northern India and Central Deccan. He observes that the Vakataka territory comprised the 30 districts of present Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh. Now, the Vakatakas were divided into two branches. The main branch of the Vakataka was that of Pravarapura Nandivardhana. Another branch ruled from Vatsagulma. Probably it was originally an army garrison town. Now, the Vakatakas and the Guptas. As we have already discussed that the Vakatakas and the Guptas ruled almost in the same period. Under the Vakatakas, monarchical polity was consolidated in the region. This was actually the norm of the period, that most of the polities were actually monarchical polities, and the Ganashanghavar polity, which was again another alternative polity, that was on the decline during this period. So, arguing for the equal importance of the Vakatakas and the Guptas in the political scenario of India in the 4th to the 6th century, R.C. Majumdar and A.S. Altekar had named their study on the period as the Vakataka Gupta age. This is very important because as early as that period of the nationalist historians, they realized that the Vakatakas were equally important in the political scenario. They named their study as the Vakataka Gupta age. The importance of the Vakatakas as a political power is amply demonstrated by their marriage alliance with the Guptas. Prabhavati Gupta, the daughter of Chandragupta II, the Gupta emperor, was actually married to the Vakataka king Rudrasena II. So this indicates the importance of the Vakatakas. They were as important as the Guptas also wanted to have matrimonial alliances with this power. Why? We shall discuss these points later on. This is the chronology of the Vakatakas as prepared by V.V. Mirashi, about whom we have already discussed. They had two branches, beginning with Vindhya Shakti I, who began his rule probably in the middle of the 3rd century CE. He was succeeded by Pravarashana I, and then we have two branches. The main branch begins with Gautamiputra, then Rudrasena I, Prithvisena, Rudrasena II, and then the main branch ended their rule in the 3rd quarter of the 5th century CE. And then we have the Vatsagulma branch. It was the very first member of this branch was Sarvasena, and he was succeeded by Vindhya Shakti II, and they ended their rule sometimes later than the main branch in around 500 CE. For most of the period, this Vatsagulma branch actually served subordinate to the main branch of the Vakatakas. This place is called Mansar. This is a town in the Ramtek Tehsil of the Nagpur district in Maharashtra. Here we have many excavated structures. Some of them has been identified with a temple and a residence, and it has been suggested that these excavated structures probably belonged to Pravarapura, the temple and residence of the Vakataka king Pravarashana II of the main branch. These are some important publications on the Vakatakas about which we have already discussed. You have the study on the Vakataka Gupta age. The name of the study is very important, as we have already discussed. It was by R.C. Majumdar and A.S. Altekar, a very important study. And then another important study on the Vakatakas were done by V.V. Mirashi. As I have already discussed that he compiled all the inscriptions together. Not only that, in the introduction, Mirashi describes about the chronology of the Vakatakas, the succession of the Vakatakas, the administration, their religion, their art and architecture, everything. So this is a very important study on the Vakatakas. Now we shall have some discussions on the title of the kings in the Vakataka polity. Pravarashana I, he assumed the title Dharma Maharaja, and he performed Vedic sacrifices like Ashwamedha, Vajapaya, etc. Now, what is the significance of this title, and what is the significance of the claim made by Pravarashana I that he performed these Vedic sacrifices? Now, Dharma Maharaja means the righteous conqueror. So, Dharma Maharaja signifies a king who claims conquest not by force but by his right. So, this is the thing which Pravarashana I wanted to highlight, that he was a righteous conqueror, he does not conquest by force. Pravarashana I also assumed the titles of Samrat, which is a very modest title as compared to the Guptas. Then again his successors used the modest title of Maharaja. V.V. Mirashi. Now you can see that the Vakatakas actually adopted very modest title compared to the Guptas, because the Guptas adopted very high sounding titles like the Maharaja Dhiraja, that means the king of the kings, the Parameshvara, Parama Bhattaraka. So this meant the supreme sovereign, the supreme lord. But compared to that, although they are contemporaries, the Vakatakas adopted very modest kind of titles like the Maharaja, the Samrat, the Maharaja, etc. So why did they use such modest titles? V.V. Mirashi points out that even before Samudragupta, when there was no question of subordination to the Guptas, the kings of the Vatsagulma branch had assumed the title of Maharaja. This he suggested because some scholars thought that why did the Vakatakas used so many modest titles? Were they subordinate to the Gupta kings? No. V.V. Mirashi, for this reason, V.V. Mirashi points out that they were never subordinate to the Guptas. So the use of modest title by the Vakatakas definitely does not suggest the subordinate status. We may therefore presume that the Vakatakas liked to use modest title, so they use this type of titles like the Maharaja and the Samrat. Now the order of succession as reflected in the records of the Vakatakas. Here we have the seal of a very important copperplate charter, about which we shall have some detailed discussion later on. This is the Chammok copperplate issued by Pravarashana II of the main branch. This is the seal of the Chammok copperplate. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4 lines in the seal. And what did they say in this seal? They took pride on their right of hereditary descent. This is indicated by the seal legend that their royalty was obtained in course of succession. Now this is the text of the seal of the Vakataka Chammok copperplate. It says Vakataka Lalamasya Krama Prapta Nripashriya Ragya Pravara Senasya Shasanam Ripu Shasanam. What does that mean? This is the enemy chastising command. Enemy chastising command is Ripu Shasanam. The Ripus are actually the enemies. So this is the enemy chastising command of King Pravarashana II, the ornament of the Vakatakas. The Vakataka Lalama. Lalama means ornament, the ornament of the Vakatakas, who has attained royal fortune by inheritance. Krama Prapta Nripa Shriya. So this is very important. If we compare this with the Guptas always claimed themselves as divinities. In the Allahabad pillar inscription, Samudragupta says that he is actually a Lokadhamna Deva. So he is actually a god who resides on earth in the form of human being. But the Vakatakas never made such claims. They only said in their seal that they has attained the royal fortune by inheritance and not by any divine thing. The titles of the kings and claims made regarding origin in the Vakataka inscriptions. Prithvisena I assumed the title of Dharma Vijay. Dharma Vijay again can be compared with the title of Dharma Maharaja. This also means the righteous conqueror. Unlike the Gupta rulers, they did not claim the divine origin, which we have already discussed. Rather, they believed that they owed their royal fortune to the grace of the Ishta Devata. Thus, Rudrasena II says that his royal fortune was due to the grace of the god Chakropani, that is Vishnu. On the other hand, the subordinates of Mekala. Mekala is again a kingdom to the western part near the west coast. Mekala, their subordinates of Mekala describe themselves as Paramaguru, deities and supreme divinities. So if we compare the claims made by the Vakatakas with the claims made by the claims made by their feudatories in the inscriptions regarding their origin, we shall have again the impression that Vakatakas were actually very modest in their claims. Thus, the Vakatakas appear to have been in favor of keeping a very modest tone as compared to the feudatories in the matter of claiming the royal status. Now, the feudatories of the Vakatakas. The Vakataka land grants referred to three kinds of feudatories. First, those who submitted to the emperor when they came to know of his resolve to subdue them. Those who submitted on being attacked, and lastly, those who were vanquished by the valor of the king. Like their Gupta contemporaries, the Vakataka polity had an important place for allies and feudatories. But one element that characterized their polity was strict control and authority. There is evidence showing that the Vakataka rulers actually exercised rigid control over their feudatories and administration. This is reflected in their inscriptions. The Vakataka feudatories do not fail to mention their Vakataka suzerains like Prithvisena I of the Nandivardhana Pravarapura branch, that is the main branch, and Harishena of the Vatsagulma branch. So as you can see that the Vakataka's feudatories always refer to their overlords in their charters. But this was not the case with the Guptas, where we find that several subordinates and feudatories of the Guptas, they issued land grant charters without naming their overlord. So compared to the feudatories of the Guptas, the Vakataka feudatories appears to have been much more modest. The Vakataka feudatories thus used modest titles in the Chammak and Pattan copperplate grants. Konda Raja and Narayana Raja both use the title Raja. This we can again compare with the title adopted by the ruler of Punravardhana, which is a province which was the Gupta province in North Bengal. The provincial governor of Punravardhana Bhukti assumed the title of Maharaja. So compared to this, the position of the Vakataka feudatories appeared to be quite humble and modest. Now the queens of the Vakatakas, as we have already told that the queens had a very important role in the polity of the Vakatakas. Unlike the Gupta kings, the Vakataka records do not refer to the queens of the ruling kings in their grants and the seals of charters, because in the Gupta copperplate they always trace their genealogy with the reference to the queens. So we learned that Chandragupta the first wife was Kumara Devi, or Datta Devi was the wife of Samudragupta. But in the Vakata chronology of the Vakatakas, the queens do not appear regularly. The only exception is Prabhavati Gupta, the Agra Mahishi. Agra Mahishi refers to the chief queen of Rudrasena II and Ajita Bhattarika, the queen of Narendra Sena. Why they were mentioned, this we shall discuss later. The former acted as regent of her minor son, that is Prabhavati Gupta, who is the daughter of Chandragupta II. She acted as the regent of her minor son Yuvaraja Divakarasena for at least 13 years. During this period, the influence of the Guptas on the Vakataka must have been surely increased in the royal court. However, the active role of Prabhavati Gupta in the administration must have been an exception, because the queens normally did not take part in administration. This was surely an exception because Prabhavati Gupta was the daughter of the illustrious Gupta emperor Chandragupta II. This is the famous Puna plates of Prabhavati Gupta. This is famous because this was issued in the name of a queen, which is comparatively rare in ancient India. And on the top you can see the seal of the copper plate, and here the two plates on which the charter has been engraved. Now the administrative unit in the Vakataka emperor. The Vakataka kingdom was subdivided into a number of Rajya, Kata, Patta, Marga, Ahara, Bhoga, Bhukti and Rashtra. Among these units we find mention of Ahara in the Satavahana inscriptions. So most probably they adopted the name of this unit from the Satavahanas whom they succeeded actually. And then again Bhukti. and Rashtra, Bhoga, these kinds of units we find in the Gupta inscriptions. So as we have already discussed, there was a unique synthesis of the Gupta elements and the Satavahana elements in the administration of the Vakatakas. The Belora plates refer to the Pakhana Rashtra and the Chammak plates mentioned Bhojakata Rajya. These larger divisions were again subdivided into Vishayas or districts, as for example Panchagarta Vishaya in the Uttara Rashtra division of the Mekala state. Bhojakata was again a Vishaya in the Amaravati area. The Bennakata Vishaya was in the modern Bhandara and the Balaghat areas. These were again divided into Aharas, as for example Shupratishta Ahara in the Vardha belt, and again into Bhuktis, as for example we have reference to the Asi Bhukti. The Rajya and Kata were larger divisions. The Rajya included subdivisions like Rashtra, Bhoga and Marga. Kata was divided into Pattas and Bhoga. The divisions Patta and Marga were probably named after their directions, which is very important. How did they name their divisions of empire? Such as Apara Patta and Uttara Patta. Apara means west and Uttara means north, and Uttara Marga, so the northern path, the Uttara Marga. Padmapura Purva Marga. So again we have a reference to the Purva Marga or the western path, or rather the western unit, and Padmapura Apara Marga, the western part of Padmapura. So they have named their divisions according to the directions. The other divisions like Aharas and Bhuktis were also probably the parts of the Rajyas. As the Vakataka inscriptions do not give sufficient information regarding the relations between these divisions, their status or their size, etc., it is not possible to present a coordinate study of the administrative division of the Vakatakas. Now, the officers of the Vakataka administration. The Dasha Kumara Charita of Dandi, who was a very famous poet, gives us a picture of the political and social life under the Vakatakas. It refers to the mantrins, that means the councillors, and the Adhyaksha or the heads of the departments, but they do not find mention in the royal records of the Vakatakas. The officers appointed to administer the Rajyas or the provinces were known as Rajyadhikrita. Chamidasa, mentioned in the Tirodi plates, was an officer of this rank, so he was a Rajyadhikrita. An officer called Bhojaka is mentioned in the India office plate of the Vakataka Devasena of the Vatsagulma branch. In the grant, he is mentioned among one of the touring officials of the king. The Sarvadhyaksha is mentioned frequently in the Vakataka grants. V.V. Mirashi thinks that he was the head of the secretariat. He had the right to appoint subordinate officers called the Kulaputras, who were responsible for the execution of the royal orders. Now the term Kulaputra suggests that they possibly belong to the royal family, because Kula is the royal family, or else he may also belong to a noble family. Kula means both a royal family or a very noble and elite family. Their primary duty was to maintain law and order. Now the Bhattas and Chhatras, they functioned under the Kulaputras. The Bhattas were soldiers, while the Chhatras, according to Mirashi, were policemen. Together, these Kulaputras, the Bhattas and Chhatras, used to visit the villages in order to collect the revenue. So we have references to the Agga Sanchari Kulaputradhikrita Bhatta Chhatrascha in the Vakataka copper plates. These persons could seize, they were very powerful, they could seize the treasure trove, work salt and other mines, and make the villagers work without wages for the state. The villagers had to provide food and shelter to these touring officers. So these officers must be very oppressive actually to the villagers. That is the reason why they must have surely exacted money from the villagers and were oppressive towards them. That is the reason why villages, when the villages were actually granted to the Brahmanas, these officers were all prohibited from entering these gift villages. by the state itself. The Vakataka land grants also make it clear that if the Doni Brahmana is accused of high treason or murder of a Brahmana, theft, adultery or any such heinous crime, the above officers could interfere. So, as you can see that these officers were very powerful. In every record of land grant, it is the Kulaputras, Bhattas and Chhatras who were informed about the royal gift according to this reason. Our Rajuka again finds mention in the indoor plates of the Pravarashana II. Now, who was the Rajuka? From the Ashokan edicts. So, Rajuko was a very important official who was mentioned actually in the edicts of Ashoka in the Mauryan period. From these edicts, we learn that the Rajukos were like settlement officers who used to measure lands with the help of a rope or Rajju for the assessment of revenue. So, they were called the Rajukos. They could reward or inflict punishment over people also. So, as you can see in the Mauryan administration, the Rajukos were very important. But what was the status in the Vakataka administration? In the Vakataka charter, they seem to have lost this status and they appeared only as the writer of the charter. The Rahasika, which is again very interesting a term because Rahasya means something very confidential. So, there was an officer called Rahasika. He is mentioned in the Bamhani plates. They were probably like private secretary to the king who used to deal with confidential matters. Among the military and police officers, the Senapati and the Dandanayaka finds mention in the Vakataka charters. The charters used to be drafted in the office of the Senapati. So, as you can see that the Senapati and the Dandanayaka, not only they led the army, but they had some other important functions to do, like the drafting of, supervise the drafting of the copperplate charters. The high rank officers of the Gupta inscriptions with illustrious titles like Kumaramatya, Sandhi Vigrahika, Mahadandanayaka, they do not find mention in the records of the Vakatakas. So, in terms of the titles of the officers, the Vakatakas again appear to have been very more. The other officials, V.V. Mirashi refers to the frequent transfers made in the administration. The post of the Senapati was held by different persons or by the same persons at different times during the reign of Pravarashana II. Thus, the Senapati was Chitravarman in the 11th and the 13th regnal year, Bappa in the 18th and 25th years, Namidasa and Chamidasa in the 23rd year, Katyayana in the 27th year and Madhappa in the 29th year, as would appear from the Pandurna plates of Pravarashana II. So, there were frequent transfer in the administration. The other officials, the Aggaswamis, are often found announcing the order of the land grant by the kings. In other cases, the Dutakas or the Agyapatis, as they would appear in the Basim copperplate, the very first copperplate charter of the Vakatakas, they communicated, the Dutakas communicated the order to the office of the Senapati. The names of the persons who drafted the charters are sometimes recorded in the inscriptions. Now, this is again very interesting to note that often the goldsmith, the Suvarnakara, was entrusted with the job of engraving the charter. Why a Suvarnakara would be entrusted with the duty of engraving the charter? This was obviously due to his skill with the metal, that he could engrave with his chisel very well, so he was entrusted with the duty of engraving a copperplate charter. The village officials. Names of village officers actually appear in the Bamhani plates. The Gramakuta was the head of the village. There is a reference to the Dronagraka Nayaka. Then Mirashi suggests that this Dronagraka Nayaka could have been the head of the Dronagraka, the larger territorial division in which the gift village was actually situated. In the Arthashastra, Dronamukha was the chief village among the 400 villages in a territorial division. So, the term Drona we can find in the Arthashastra and connect it to the term mentioned in the Arthashastra. The other village officials, Dronagraka Nayaka might have been the head of one such chief village, and hence he was an important official to be addressed in the royal charter. The Devavarika helped the Gramakuta in the matter of administration. He may be identical with the Dauvarika or Pratihara, referring to the village police. The Gandakas could have been responsible for collecting revenue and other dues and maintaining peace and order in the villages. So you can see that there were many important village officials who find mention in the Vakataka inscriptions, and the Vakatakas had organized a very elaborate machinery for the administration of the villages. Now, the sources of revenue. The chief source of income to the state was obviously land revenue. The Vakataka inscriptions refer to klipta and upaklipta. Klipta, in the sense of a fixed assessment, occurs in the Arthashastra. It probably meant land tax according to V.V. Mirashi. Upaklipta, on the other hand, may be minor taxes as would appear from the prefix upa. The state preserved the right to confiscate the treasure and deposits discovered accidentally. Traditionally, digging for salt was a royal monopoly to the kings. This was the case with every Indian polity. The Vidarbha region has salt mines. Mirashi specifically refers to the name of the village Lonar, derived from Sanskrit Lavanakara, in the Vidarbha region. It is particularly famous for salt mines. Again, fermenting of liquor was a royal prerogative. The Vakataka land grants contain expression Pushpa Khira Sandoha that indicates that the village officers were authorized to collect different types of taxes in kinds like flowers, pushpa, khira, milk, etc. The state could enforce people to work for public utility. Facilities like providing grass for feeding the horses and bullock, hides for seat and charcoals for cooking had to be provided to the touring officers by the villagers. Of course, the Agrahara villages, which means the tax-free villages granted to the Brahmanas by the copper plate charters, they were exempted from such kinds of payments and obligations. This is the Chammak copper plate of Pravarashana II. Why this charter is important? Because this is a unique charter which actually refers to some obligations put on the Brahmana recipients, because normally in the copper plate charter we do not find any obligation imposed over the recipients. All the obligations have been imposed on the villagers who reside in the gift villages, but in this case obligations have been also imposed on the recipients. What are these obligations? It says, and this condition of the charter should be maintained by the Brahmanas and the future kings as long as the sun and the moon will endure. That is, the impact of the grant is permanent and the grant is to be enjoyed permanently for generation to generation by the Brahmana Doni, provided that they commit no treason against the kingdom consisting of 7 constituents of the future kings, that they are not found guilty of the murder of a Brahmana, theft, adultery and high treason, etc., that they do not wage war, and that they do not harm to other villages, but if they act otherwise or assent to such acts, the king will commit no theft if he takes the land away. So this is a unique kind of thing mentioned in the Chammak copper plate of Pravarashana II. It imposes these obligations over the Doni that only the Doni could enjoy the grant on such conditions that he would not do these things. Now, as you can see, the 7 constituents, the emphasis on maintaining the Saptanga are 7 elements of the state. The 7 elements of the state are again mentioned in the Arthashastra as Swami, the Lord, Amatya, the Mantri, Janapada, the territory, Kosha, the treasury, Danda, the rod of punishment, the law of punishment, Mitrani, the allies or friends, and the Prakrita. So these are the 7 Prakritis. Prakritis are actually 7 elements of state mentioned as Saptanga in the Arthashastra. So we have a reference to this Saptanga in the Chammak copper plate of Pravarashana. The emphasis on maintaining the Saptanga or 7 elements of the state as propounded by Kautilya in the Chammak plates is very interesting. we may presume that since the Vakatakas, now the area of the Vakatakas were very important, because the Vakatakas were the first who probably reconstructed, established a monarchical polity in the Vidarbha region, and they probably had built up agrarian structure, and there was an expansion of settlement, expansion of agriculture, everything happened under the Vakatakas. So the area of Vidarbha became very important due to the expansion of agriculture. So in this ambience, so we may presume that since the Vakatakas were responsible for the expansion of agriculture in a pre-state area, such obligations were necessary for the security of the state. K. M. Shrimali thus observes that whether the obligations of the Donis were negative or positive or both, the purpose seemed to be only one, that is to blunt any political opposition to the royal authority. So as you can see, the Vakatakas and Guptas were very important and both of them were contemporary. Thus we may say that although the Vakatakas maintain a low and rather unassuming profile in their use of royal titles or organizing the administration in the titles adopted by their officers, still they fully realized the necessity of keeping a strict control over the Brahmana Donis, who were actually the agents of state formation in this area. Thank you.